I wanted to bring up my recent shopping slash photography trip to a place called Second and Charles. This is a chain of bookstores that also specialize in comics, toys, records, movies, clothing, and just your average pop culture stuff. We've got a large Second and Charles store in Jacksonville. Honestly, if my city didn't already have the best bookstores on the East Coast in Chamberlain's Book Mine, then the Second and Charles store would be maybe a frequent place I'd go, but because of all the other stores in the area, I go to Second and Charles about 4 times per year just to see if they have any new vintage stuff and to buy a few things before Tom Simon can get there. But he hates Second and Charles, so there's probably no competition between the two of us. So my wife and I, we stopped in there recently just to kill some time before hitting a nearby restaurant. The first thing I saw on the shelves was a book called Dominion by Fred Saberhagen. This is a Tor paperback in his Dracula series. I don't see these out very much. I found an old doll paperback in the Gore saga, or the Counter Earth saga, whatever you want to call it. I saw a book called On the Shoulders of Giants, which looks like a Viking or a fantasy novel in a series called Dream Quest. It was published in the late 1980s by Signet. The author is Lloyd St. Alcorn, but that's really David N. Meyer. I found a series I wasn't aware of, men's action adventure, or maybe you want to call it military fiction, just simply called Navy SEALs by a guy named Mike Murray. I'm not sure if that's his name or pseudonym. It wouldn't surprise me if it's written by someone like Mike Newton or Mark Roberts. This book was the second installment called Green Solitaire. There's a stack of 9 Stony Man paperbacks. There was a hardcover edition of Alistair MacLean's River of Death. Not a great book, but a cool edition of it. Someone unloaded their entire James A. Michener collection because there's a shelf there featuring like 20 of his books in hardcover, paperback. They are stacked in there, some as low as $1. There was a vintage Dell paperback of Elmore Leonard's The Moonshine War, which has a beautiful painted cover. There was also Lauren Estelman's General Murders paperback. That's a Fawcett Gold Medal release featuring 10 Amos Walker short stories. I like that author and I like that character. There was a vintage Dell paperback with a great aviation painted style cover called The Fight of the Few by Richard Hoe. It looked great. There was a vintage paperback from Berkeley called Shadows, which is an anthology of various horror stories written by guys like Stephen King. He's always in these anthologies. There were 10 shelves between 2 cabinets that featured nothing but Clive Cussler. We see his books everywhere. This shelf had about 8 to 10 Cussler books and various series titles. There's 10, like I said, there's 10 shelves, 2 huge cabinets. So there's probably well over 100 Clive Cussler books there for the taking. There was War the Ninja Master #2, the Shibo Discipline, on Warner Books from the 1980s. Some of your old timers out there, like myself, may remember the old Mork and Mindy series. I think it was on ABC, if I'm not mistaken. The book I found is from Pocket Books, and it's a Mork and Mindy novel written by Ralph Church based on a TV show. I don't know if it's based on an episode that aired or if it's just an original. I've never seen a Mork and Mindy book out and about. There were 3 Gold Eagle paperbacks in the Outlander series, which is a spin-off of Deathlands. There was a vintage paperback from Fawcett called Shock Trauma, written by Joe Franklin and Alan DeLaelo. It looks like a great mix of horror and medical stuff, like a medical thriller. It looks really cool. I found an old Ace vintage paperback from Keith Laumer titled Worlds of the Imperium. And if you're keeping track at home, that was Ace M-165, which would have cost you 45 cents in 1962. This was the first book in his Imperium series, which, listen to this, it's got a cool premise. There are 3 books in the series, and they concern parallel worlds that are policed by an agency called Imperium. In the first book, it contains a world where the American Revolutionary War never happened. Kind of reminds me of watching that old Sliders television show where they get into all these alternate universes and histories. Sounds cool. There was another book I found there, which is new to me. It's the debut paperback called Born to Run, which is in a series called Serrated Edge. It's got a painted cover, books from the early 90s. It's on Baen Books, Baen. Looks to be like maybe a mix of cyberpunk or maybe urban fantasy, sci-fi, something or another. I saw 2 vintage fighting fantasy game book paperbacks with amazing cover art. For you gamers, this was number 5 and 6, both on Dell. A book called The Blitzlight Passage by David Mason on Pyramid Books. Another great painted cover. This one is an espionage thriller concerning the Hindenburg explosion. There's plenty of fantasy, sci-fi paperbacks from authors like Andre Norton. There was an old analog magazine set there. There was a remarkable collection of 100 trade paperbacks called Science Fiction Masterworks. And these books collect vintage sci-fi stories and books, and I counted, they had 100 of these. They're distributed in the U.S. by Hachette Book Group, but they originate in England via Orion Publishing Group. I've seen them online, but I've never actually seen one in the wild, much less like a complete shelving system dedicated to them. I thought it was really interesting. I found another vintage series I wasn't aware of called Warbots. This is a Pinnacle series that launched in 1988, and there were 12 books all the way up until 1992. The front looks like a combination of like Terminator and maybe like a Stormtrooper. This paperback is number 5, Operation High Dragon. But I only walked away with 2 paperbacks and spent approximately $1.80. The first paperback I bought is an anthology called 14 Vicious Valentines, and it was published by Avon in 1988. I glanced at the table of contents in the store, saw stories were written by the likes of Talmadge Powell, Nedra Tyer, William Nolan, Bill Kreider, Rick Hodgela. But after last episode, we talked about Simon Ark, created and written by Edward Hoke. I was delighted to see that Edward Hoke is in this collection, and guess what? It's a Simon Ark story. This Simon Ark story is called The Virgins of Valentine. In my brief glance, it shows that Ark and the narrator are in snowy Valentine, Pennsylvania, to stop virgins from being sacrificed at an old cemetery on Friday the 13th on the first day of the full moon on the eve of St. Valentine's Day. Okay, that's weird. It definitely deserves to be part of an anthology called 14 Vicious Valentines. So I'm looking forward to read that story. About maybe, 10, 15 pages. The second paperback I bought led to a domestic dispute. I'm serious. A domestic dispute happened because of a book purchase. So listen, I never, ever see the television tie-in paperbacks for the A-Team. They exist. They were published by Dell in the 1980s during that show's popularity. The A-Team was a men's action-adventure series about mercenaries. However, I don't see the books out very much. So I found one for 50 cents. This is the A-Team number 5, 10% of Trouble. Being that I never see these, being that I love the show, being that you guys need some TV tie-in discussion right here on the show, it was a no-brainer. So I get out to the parking lot with my 2 books, and my wife, who's so patient with me, she never rushes me in the bookstores. She'll shop with me, or she'll just sit down and do stuff on her phone. So she just gingerly asked what I bought. And I show her the A-Team book, and how I never see these out, and how excited I was to find one. She looks at me like I have 2 heads, and she says, "They're everywhere. They're everywhere, honey." And I'm like, "Excuse me?" She says, "We see the A-Team books in the stores all the time." And I counter with, No, we do not." So we get fussy with each other. She says that the A-Team books are immensely popular and that we've seen them before, and I didn't buy them because I told her that they are everywhere. I say that absolutely isn't true, and I say it defiantly. I then figure out what she's talking about. The light bulb went off, and maybe you even know what she's referring to. She's thinking Able Team, not A-Team. Of course. I see them everywhere. That was a long-running series of paperbacks by Gold Eagle in the Mac Bolan universe. Every bookstore I go to seems to have at least one. I get it. She still says that's not the case. She's still saying that we're seeing the A-Team books everywhere. So anyway, there's more development on that later, I believe. But you'll be happy to know that the fuss between 2 middle-aged adults in the parking lot of a used Jacksonville bookstore over men's action-adventure fiction from 40 years ago did not disrupt the evening or our dinner. I'm right, she's wrong, and that's easy to digest.